All right.
Okay, let's bring the meeting to order. Everybody please stand for the flag salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Amen. Can we have the roll call, please?
Bruce Francis,
Present.
Christopher Farrar,
Present.
John Orr is excused, Michael Magyar is absent, Myrna Patrick. Here. Nadia Gardner is excused, Robert Strickland.
Here. Okay, take a motion and a second to adopt the agenda as presented.
I move we adopt the agenda as presented.
Second.
Be moved and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
None opposed? That passes. Business from the public. This is an opportunity for anyone to give a brief presentation about any land use planning issues or county concern that's not on the agenda. Not seeing anybody. I guess everybody's here for the agenda.
I move that we adopt the minutes of November.
Well, let's look at them first.
Oh, we have. We've all read them.
Okay, so has everybody looked at the minutes?
Of course. I move that we adopt the minutes of the November 12th, 2019 Clatsop County Planning Commission regular session as presented.
Second.
So it'd be moved and seconded to approve the minutes of the November 12th, 2019.
Do we have enough people here to pass that? Only three of us?
Three can do it.
Three can do it. Okay.
No, I can't vote because I wasn't here.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So, all those in favor?
Aye.
You can have an abstention.
Yeah, one abstention.
Okay.
3-4, so it passes. Thank you. So now we're on to a public hearing, consolidated application. So we've got Will Kaplinger, 2 Branches Consulting LCC, on behalf of Michael Benish, property owner, has submitted a similar use application requesting the Planning Commission determine that a commercial trucking use is similar to other permitted uses in the Rural Community Commercial RCC zone under Section 3.258, Commercial Conditional Development and Use. The request is part of a consolidated application which includes a conditional use request to establish a 3,000 square foot structure that would house an existing commercial trucking company. So, does any commissioner have an ex parte contact of interest to report?
No.
Does any commissioner have a conflict of interest to report?
No.
Does anybody object to the jurisdiction of the commission to hear this matter at this time?
No.
Hearing none, we'll turn it over to staff. Ian, please make the presentation.
Thank you, Chair Francis. Good morning, Planning Commissioners. As Chair Francis summarized well, the request today is a consolidated application. There is a similar use request, and the similar use request is to determine a commercial trucking use is similar in use and compatibility to other uses in the conditional use category as a Type 2 procedure in the RCC, Rural Community Commercial Zone, and a conditional use request to construct a 3,000 square foot building to operate an existing commercial trucking company. Again, the applicant is Will Kaplinger of 2 Branches Consulting. The property owner is Michael Benish. The location of the property is addressed as 34850 Highway 101 Business. That's on the south side of the highway. It's about 750 feet west of the intersection with Highway 101 Business, Youngs River Road, and Lewis and Clark Road. The property zoning designation is, again, Rural Community Commercial, that's RCC. It is in the flood hazard overlay, that's the AE 100-year zone, which is considered a special flood hazard area. Other layers on the property are the National Wetlands Inventory, And I will note that the National Wetlands Inventory map shows quite a bit of the property covered in wetlands, but the applicant has obtained a professional wetland delineation, which has been accepted by the Oregon Department of State Lands. And so that pushes the boundary back toward the back of the property and gives some more room that wouldn't be encumbered by wetlands. The comprehensive plan designation is development. And a couple of exhibits attached to the staff report. We have actually 3 applications that were submitted by the applicant. We have the similar use, the conditional use, and a preliminary proposal for a site plan review application, and then copies of the public notice are in there as well as Exhibit 2. There were no public or agency comments as of this morning, so no comments on the application.
So can I just ask a question?
Sure.
You say that DSL has approved the setback and that we pushed it further back towards the back of the property. Does that mean that the existing 80-foot and 100-foot are correct? They're not revised, or they are the revised?
So the applicant provided a preliminary site plan, which is in the staff report and then also attached in the first exhibit. The wetland delineation is also in that first exhibit. So the applicant, or it's rather the property owner, hired a professional wetland consultant to map the wetland boundary. And then the process for having DSL accept that is to submit it to them, have them review it, and then issue a statement that they agree with the mapped wetland boundary per the professional
Okay,
consultant's
so
delineation.
what we have here has been approved. This is the latest figures that they
Right.
have. Okay.
Yeah, so the line that's on the applicant's site plan is approximate, but it's really close to what was approved by the Department of State
Okay,
Lands.
that's all I needed to know. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So again, the applicant is requesting that the Planning Commission determine a commercial trucking business should be allowed as a Type 2 commercial conditional use in the RCC zone, and accordingly, a conditional use application is being made simultaneously with and in support of that similar use request. So the owner intends the commercial trucking use to accommodate a specific business, that is Dennis Horton Trucking. They currently operate under a multi-tenant lease on the adjacent property. So immediately to the east of the subject property is where Dennis Horton Trucking currently operates. Moving next door would allow them to have their own facility and yard independent of other tenants. They are proposing a 3,000 square foot facility to maintain their small fleet of tractor trailers. And their fleet is about 5 trucks, 3 to 5 trucks. And they mostly haul lumber, as I'm aware, for Hampton, and lumber is a big client of theirs. So they also provide hauling services for other local businesses. Employees will come to the site, park their vehicles there, their personal vehicles there, pick up an empty truck, travel to a loading site, deliver that load to its destination, and then return the truck back to the subject property. According to the applicant, they are not planning to deliver, store, transfer, handle freight on the subject property. Could be a point of clarification. Staff has seen at the current property some trucks that are loaded with lumber rather, and so they're probably just using that as a staging area in between pickups and deliveries, but something you may want to consider and have the applicant clarify for us. The applicant has requested the Planning Commission determine the commercial trucking use is similar in use and compatibility to, quote, buildings and uses of a public works, public service, or public utility nature. That may include equipment storage, repair yards, warehouses, or related activities. This is allowed as a Type 2 commercial conditional use in the RCC zone under Section 3.258, subsection 12. The conditional use application for the business and the 3,000 square foot building will be addressed following the determination of whether commercial trucking constitutes a similar use in the zone. Information from the conditional use application is used to support the case for the similar use determination, but in the staff report, we look at the similar use standards first and then move on to conditional use. Neighborhood conditions, if you're on page 8 of your packet at the bottom of the page, just want to point out, as you probably know, Miles Crossing is a mixed-use area consisting of commercial, light industrial, and residential uses. It, along the Highway 101 business corridor, was formerly zoned general commercial, which allowed a slightly broader set of uses that included some more light industrial. And so up until 2003, there were developments and businesses going in that had a little bit more of a light industrial use activity. And so what you see today is sort of the leftovers of that. And currently, under the RCC zoning, the set of uses is more limited. The existing businesses that were there prior to 2003 and the adoption of the RCC zone are allowed to continue as legal non-conforming uses. And just across the street, the Planning Commission recently approved another consolidated similar use and conditional use application to allow the establishment of a commercial freight operator, TP Freight, which is currently under construction. And so something to consider today is the difference between something designated commercial freight, which is a higher intensity, larger building, handling and transfer of freight on site, versus what the applicant is proposing to be called commercial trucking, which would be smaller facility, low intensity, and no storage or transfer of freight on site. Evaluation of the application against the applicable criteria. Section A is the Land and Water Development and Use Ordinance. Under Article 2, we have the Type 3 procedure and public deliberations and hearings. The materials to support those criteria being met are found in Exhibit 2. There are copies of the public published and posted notices. Under Section 5.060, that's developments and uses of the same type, we have the Planning Commission shall examine the characteristics of developments and uses not listed in any zone and make a determination as to what zone the development and use may be allowed, permitted with review, or conditional. The Planning Commission shall base its decision on findings that the development is consistent with the purpose of the zoning classification and is similar to the types of development and use permitted or conditional in the zone. And we are following a Type 3 procedure as required. So my finding for that section is inclusive of the applicant's response. And so the applicant had stated that the commercial trucking use is not listed anywhere else in the zoning ordinance. This is new language, those two words being put together. The applicant reviewed other trucking uses that are allowed throughout the zoning ordinance and made the argument that the request, again, is for a much lower intensity use than what's provided for with the other trucking and freighting type uses that are currently listed and defined in the ordinance. So because commercial trucking is not listed in any other zone, the Planning Commission's review is subject to this procedure set forth in Section 5.060, which involves determining whether the proposed use is consistent with the purposes of the RCC zone and whether it is similar with other uses permitted in the zone.
Can I ask it?
Yeah.
On page 8, the subject property is in the red area. What's the blue zone?
The blue zone is RCI, which is Rural Community Light Industrial.
Okay. And, is there any obvious difference? Kind of land-wise, it all looks like it's the same tide flat.
So the development pattern on the ground right now looks pretty consistent between those two zoning designations, but if you look at the list of permitted uses in the RCI zone as opposed to the RCC zone, in the RCI zone you would see a lot more light industrial type uses spelled out and provided for. And that would include things like fabrication and machine shops and other types of trucking and freighting uses and things along those lines. Where the RCC zone is more office, retail, sort of typical traditional commercial uses.
Does that, you know, I know you have a fresh eyes to the area relatively, but is there, do you have an idea of why it was being protected as a less industrialized area? Was it because of residential, or any sense of why delineation occurred?
We can explore that a little bit. My understanding at the surface level is that in 2003, when the Planning Commission was reviewing how to address this area, the rural community known as Miles Crossing and Jeffers Garden, that they were looking at existing residential uses, and they were looking at the existing mix of uses there. And so other staff may be able to provide more context, other commissioners may be able to provide more context as to how that decision was made and what was being discussed and why the uses were limited in the RCC zoning designation as opposed to, say, putting that light industrial zone all along that corridor.
Yep, thank you.
So I think it's time for me to recollect back in 2003 as to why we got to this point. And I think that one of the main concerns was the RCC would be limited because of at that time we were discussing water and sewage. And there was a shortage of water, and there were a number of developments taking place residentially, and we did not want to stop that development. We had certain people come in and testify they were wanting to develop residentially, and I think that we put that restriction in there to limit the amount of impact on the resources of water and sewer. That's my recollection as to why that happened. So I could see that would make kind of sense to limit, you know, it there, but then here we are. There've been a few changes since that time, and I think that they've got the water for this project. So I personally would be voting for it to be included into it, that it could be the trucking. I don't see that it's going to have a high impact on it. But that's my recollection.
So I think the best thing for me to do is just very briefly go through a couple more points in the staff report and then give you time for questions and discussion.
Yeah.
So the next section of review, so basically staff has recommended that you do approve the similar use request for commercial trucking, and that the use is found to be similar here to the section 3.258 subsection 12, which is buildings and uses of public works, public service, or public utility nature that may include equipment storage, repair yards, warehouses, or related activities. Obviously, the difference here is that this is a commercial use and not a public works use. However, that public works use, interestingly, is listed under a commercial conditional use section. So again, staff has agreed with the applicant that the proposal is consistent with what's provided for under that subsection and has recommended the Planning Commission approve the similar use request. And under Article 6, starting on page 13 of your packets, we have a further procedure for authorization of a similar development, and this would allow you to, if you choose, to recommend that the Board of Commissioners add commercial trucking as a use listed in the Type 2 commercial conditional use section of the RCC zone. The applicant has not requested for it to be added to the ordinance. I will point that out, but there are findings here supporting that decision if you choose to go that route. Then under section 3.252, we have the purpose and intent of the rural community commercial zone. Again, the procedure set out in 5.060 for determining a similar use says you have to agree that the proposal meets the purpose and intent of the zone. Staff has found that it does. The applicant has laid out an argument showing that it meets each of the 5 listed elements there under purpose and intent. Then moving forward, we have development and use standards. Most of the standards will be met with the final site plan review. We also are requiring a flood hazard permit as the property is in the flood hazard overlay, and then an erosion control plan, as well as final commercial site plan review. And under section 5, we have conditional development and use standards, where we're looking at the size, design, operating characteristics of the use, compatibility, transportation, public facilities, physical features, things like that. And so we have found that the property can be served adequately by public services. The applicant will need final approval from ODOT to use that existing road approach for the commercial trucking use. And again, the standards listed there in section 5.000 or 5.015 can all be met with conditions of approval, with the approval of the development permit and the site plan review and the flood hazard permit. On page 21 of your packet, under section 5.025, there is a list of additional conditions you can impose. Staff is not recommending any of those, but you do have the ability to add those. Section B of the staff report is the standards document. So looking first at off-street parking requirements. For this type of use, the off-street parking requirement would be 1 per employee on the largest shift. Based on the application, that would be 5, and the applicant has shown 5 parking spaces on their preliminary site plan. No signage has been proposed. Chapter 5 is vehicle access control and circulation. ODOT attended a pre-application conference a while back and communicated what the applicable requirements for approval of the use of the existing road approach would be. And so again, we are asking for final approval from ODOT to use that road approach before any action pursuant to the conditional use permit or on-site development. And then section C of the staff report is comprehensive plan goals and policies. Goal 1, citizen involvement, has been met. Again, in Exhibit 2, we have copies of all the required public notices. Goal 2 is land use planning. Approval of this request, approval of the similar use request and conditional use request would ensure that the proposal is consistent with Goal 2. Goal 6 is air, water, and land quality. We've sent notices to the Department of State Lands and Department of Environmental Quality. We have not received any comments from them, but we do have a condition of approval here requiring copies of any final state and federal permits prior to action pursuant to the proposal. Goal 7 is natural hazards. Once again, we are asking for a flood hazard permit, floodplain development permit rather, prior to issuance of a development permit. The proposal satisfies Goal 9 to diversify and improve the economy. Goal 11 is met. The site is served by water, sewer, and fire. And as part of the development permit application process, we will require an agency review and approval form for final sign-off from those agencies. And Goal 12, transportation, I will point out Goal 8, ensure the transportation system supports prosperous and competitive economy. Policy 8A, encourage improvements to the freight system, efficiency, access, capacity, and reliability. So approval of the proposal would allow the continuation of an existing commercial trucking company, which again currently operates right next door, has an established client list, and that satisfies Goal 8, Policy 8A of Goal 12. And the use has also been found to be consistent with the Lewis and Clark Olney-Walewski Community Plan. On page 27 of the staff report, or rather of your packet, the conclusion and recommendation, staff is recommending approval subject to the following conditions of approval. There is a set of 12 conditions and 3 regulations. Are there any questions for staff?
You mentioned an issue of trailers being loaded, found on site. Is this something that we just need to clean up so they don't feel like they're being scofflaws if they have lumber on their trailers at night?
So I didn't see any criteria that would preclude them from having loaded trailers kept there temporarily. There is a development standard that requires storage of materials to be within an enclosed building or screened from view. So materials being stored on a flatbed truck temporarily is sort of a gray area and somewhere you have some discretion to determine if that's appropriate. Again, it may be good to ask the applicant exactly how the operation works and when, if at all, there are materials being stored on trucks.
And even why we require that they be inside buildings, as some other time.
My guess would be security purposes, not having any kind of expensive goods out available in public view that might encourage people to
So
take it.
so this is a county interest in people feeling secure because we require them to store things inside.
That
buildings.
could be one interpretation. Again, it just says that materials should be stored within an enclosed building or screened from view. And so, to what extent you want to interpret that standard is up to you to decide.
I think it's a question of the applicant.
When we are putting requirements on people to do things, I think it's kind of fun to question ourselves as to why are we making these demands.
I agree, but I'll ask the applicant on that. Any other questions of staff?
I had one. Is there a official county definition of commercial trucking?
There is not. This would be a new use. It's not listed in any other.
We need a definition of what that is because it's kind of nebulous to me. Commercial trucking sounds like it could be almost anything
Right.
to do with the trucks.
I have the same question.
Making a profit kind of.
Yeah.
I don't know if we can work out a definition here.
No.
but This fits within it, but I think at some point we should define specifically what we use that.
Absolutely.
Point taken, and that's something that we could work on, especially if it's determined that this is something that should be added as a listed use in the zone, then for sure it should be clearly defined.
Yeah.
And in anticipation, and I have that with a question mark, that this is not the only one-off, and we do want to do that. And it seems like we ought to be able to come up with a description of commercial trucking. And in fact, I bet if Chris were stuck where he couldn't eat until he had to come up with one, he could come up with a definition that would be acceptable to everybody in this room.
That's probably true.
In other words, I'm sensing that's the direction we're going, is that we'd like to have this be something that would be applicable the next time this came around.
Well, on that point, I would say that while I read through the packet, that was my opinion also, I feel that with 3 members not here on the commission, I'd actually not be in favor of doing that.
You don't think it'd be the best time to do it?
Correct. I think it would be, I think it's unfortunate because as I say, I see a reason to do that, but I just feel like we should have a more complete panel of commissioners to make that move. Because I don't think of everything. I only think of about 1/10 of what this commission comes up with.
That's a true statement, but the thing is that by law, you've got a consensus of opinion here amongst the quorum, and if the quorum makes that decision, it should go forward.
Yeah,
Well, I disagree with that point of view.
That we don't have a quorum or a consensus?
No, I'll
we
vote
can't
against it.
outvote you because there are not enough of us to outvote you.
I don't mean to be difficult, but I do feel like when we make something that's more far-reaching than the immediate decision in front of us on a proposed development, that I'd rather see
Full representation,
full commission. That's just the way I feel about it.
okay? Anna, what's your opinion?
Do we need to have a commercial trucking definition today, or should we ask Ian and the staff to come up with a proposed definition for our next meeting? And for today, we can just either table it or use what we need to use in order to deal with this particular case.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's,
I'm all in
I'm all
favor
for
of
that. Yep. I think that we
I
should,
bet we can wing it, coming up with what do we mean by trucking in the course of commerce.
well, personally, I don't see the need for a definition of commercial trucking here today to move forward with this application. So I think that probably by consensus, okay, I would say that we direct staff to come up with a definition of commercial trucking and bring it to us at a meeting in the future. So I think that we can get that off the table. So I'd like to get a consensus of opinion then on who is in favour for a definition developed by staff to be presented to us at a future meeting on commercial trucking.
I would say possibly it would be trucking, commercial.
All right. However it's phrased, staff will bring it to us. So,
I
Meredith?
agree, I agree.
I agree.
You agree?
Yeah.
Okay, that's unanimous. So we'll ask staff to move forward with a definition of trucking commercial or commercial trucking, whichever way you want to do it. And we'll decide on that at a later time. Okay, so coming back down then, any other questions of staff?
No, I just want to compliment Ian again for the job that he did, because he crossed all his Ts and dotted all his Is and let us all know exactly where we stand with regard to the rules in the planning commission, so we
Right.
appreciate that.
Yeah. So to expound upon that theory, I'm going to go to page 21 and say for section 5025, requirements for conditional development and use. If staff's not recommending any of those 13 uses, why are we considering them? Because it appears to me that most of those are addressed in the code already.
Well, as it says there under 5.025, the hearing body may impose those conditions, and so they're listed there for your reference. And my finding there is just that we haven't recommended any of those, but I want you to have reference to them here in the staff report for your
Okay.
discussion
So
in case you
then,
choose.
what I'm looking at is if it's already addressed in the code and it's applicable to this application through the code, I personally don't feel that we need to put it in as a restriction or an addendum to any restrictions as part of the application. Would I be right or wrong on that? Or I should ask, not right or wrong, would you agree with that assessment?
Sure, I mean, there are some things listed there that are not, they're not standard, they're not development standards in the RCC zone, and they're not included in other parts of the conditional use review procedure. And so, back to the section 5.060 and under Article 6, you have the ability today also to determine whether there are specific standards in addition to what's already listed in the zone that should apply to this type of use.
Right.
And so if you choose to do that, then,
These could be considered.
Right.
Oh, okay. So going back to conditions that we can put into the RCC zone, and we all scratched our heads as to why we eliminated so many in 2003. I personally would like to see commercial trucking or trucking put into the RCC zone, because as you say, there are going to be more applications. I think this is going to be an ongoing thing. There's already existing uses in that zone that I feel meet that. It's similar, and I think that it meets it. So how would you like us to move forward with that?
I think that would be accomplished as part of your motion, and so in order to approve,
Well, I
What's
guess what I'm
before
asking
you?
is, do you want two motions?
yes, I think that would be good.
Okay.
One motion,
Yeah.
if you're going to recommend that the board add this to the ordinance as a permitted use,
Okay.
that should be one motion, and then approval of this application, the consolidated application, can be a separate motion,
What time do you want us to bring that forward?
at your discretion.
Because I personally feel, and I'm looking for guidance from staff, I feel that we're at the point where we could make that recommendation and then move forward.
That can be, Julia Decker, Clatsop County Planning Manager, that can be part of today's business. You can tack that onto this.
I think he's saying they're ready to do it.
I feel we're at the point
First.
where we could make that motion right now.
Well, I think you want to wait, you want to hear from your applicant, you want to determine that the use is indeed similar, and then I think you
All right,
want a separate
right.
recommendation to add it by ordinance.
All right, that sounds good. So any other questions of staff? Let's move on then to, we'll call for public testimony. This hearing is open for public testimony. Failure to raise an issue with sufficient specificity to afford the decision maker and the parties an opportunity to respond to the issue precludes appeal to the board based on that issue. All speakers from the floor are to sign in, state their name and address before speaking, and if you are appearing in a representative capacity, identify whom you represent. Limit remarks to 3 minutes in order to permit at all present an equal opportunity to speak. Testimony and evidence must be directed towards the criteria in the plan, staff report, or land use regulation which the person believes to apply to the decision. Are there any public agency comments? Seeing none, does the applicant have anything they wish to say?
Yes.
Please come forward, state your name, and we'll listen to what you have to say.
Thank you. Will Kaplinger, Two Branches Consulting LLC. Thank you very much for considering this application today. I agree with Myrna. It was an exemplary staff report. Thank you, Ian, for that. It laid it out very, very well. I'd like to address a couple of questions that came up, but first I'd like to describe Dennis Horton's use a little bit. He had this trucking business down, I think it was an RA2 zone in Gearhart, and it was among residential development. He had a house right next door. They got along with their neighbors for 20 years without complaint, and then Dennis Horton got, I think, a couple of dogs, and they didn't like the neighbor, and they'd bark at him when he came to the gate, and so then the neighbors started coming in and complaining about that. We couldn't do anything about the dogs, but then he started nailing down the trucking use, which is not permitted in the RA zone. So we tried to work with Dennis to find him alternative locations, and they're few and far between. He couldn't find any in an industrial zone or a general commercial zone, and the Calpe Trucking had something that was very similar to what he does. They just store a bunch of trucks on their property right next door. If you've seen that, it looks kind of like a junkyard, and that's not what Dennis Horton likes to do. His operation in Gearhart was pretty clean and tidy, and zero negative impacts to the area and the environment and so on. So he's been now for probably a year or so occupying Calpe Trucking there, but he's got to share it with these other tenants, and it's a little bit uncomfortable for him. And Michael Benish offered him the opportunity to move his operation right next door. And of course, it's not a specific use allowed in the ordinance. It's not defined in the ordinance. So that's why we're here today, to see if the commission approves it as a similar use, which we think it is to the uses that are already allowed there, specifically the public service yard, which allows equipment storage, warehousing, things like that, much more intensive kind of use. What Mr. Horton basically does is outlined in the staff report in the application pretty well. He has usually empty trucks that are there. Employees drive in, they park, they pick up the truck, they drive out primarily to Hampton Lumber, pick up a load and go deliver it. Sometimes they come back with an empty truck and park it there. Sometimes if they have a delivery, say to Portland, they might drive there and stay overnight in Portland and then bring the empty truck back the next day. In terms of storage, we stated in the application that it doesn't include storage And we look at the interpretation and the meaning of storage as a permanent area outdoor for storing materials, such as you would find in other businesses down there, tractors and farm supply equipment that are put out for sale, building supplies and that sort of thing. We think the odd occasion, which is kind of infrequent, when he would bring a truck to the facility and they would park it there and then pick it up and take it out the next morning, that doesn't constitute storage really. I don't think it needs screening and it doesn't require a separate definition. That simply doesn't seem to be storage of equipment and materials. Those trucks then leave the next day and it's not permanent ever. So the question of the storage, I think that's more of something like a warehouse use, and that's what you would get across the street at TP Freight, for instance, which is a much more intensive operation, where materials would be stored for a certain amount of time on site, and they're enclosed within a building, so they meet that requirement. A question that Commissioner Farrar had about the definitions, I'd like to point out there are a lot of uses in any zone that are not specifically defined in the code. That can be looked at as a detriment to applying the code standards, but on the other hand, it might not be a deficiency. You can look at it and it often is considered by staff to be something of a benefit, because if uses aren't specifically defined, then it gives the staff and the applicant the flexibility to consider uses that don't quite fit exactly those definitions. And I think that's valuable to have that. You can define a commercial trucking operation. Currently, there are things like mini storage is not defined. But there's a kind of a general idea of what constitutes a mini storage. But some people come in and say, well, can I have one unit as a mini storage? Well, that's not, the number of units isn't defined in a mini storage, so there's some flexibility there. But in terms of putting a definition of commercial trucking into the zoning code, I think that would be a process that would probably be better utilized in or applied in the current process for updating the comprehensive plan, which will then reflect into standards in the zoning code. And there are probably a number of definitions that could be added to the zoning code. So if you're going to start mucking around with definitions, it seems, bring in a laundry list, because there's quite a few that I think staff and applicants in general would like to see added to the code, so that it takes a certain amount of uncertainty out. If you wanted to define this particular operation, I think that could be done in the conditions of approval. And you could state that the use is for a certain range of trucks at certain hours of operation. If an applicant came in, either the current applicant or the current operator wanted to expand that, then he would have to come in as an expansion to an existing use. Since use permits run with the land, if a future owner came in and had a commercial trucking operation that was different in scope, they would have to apply for an expansion of a commercial use. So I think that could be done just in this application, and you wouldn't have to provide an extra burden to staff to come up with a specific definition, put it in the code when that process should be, I think, on a larger scope. And I think that's all the comments I had. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them if I could.
Why do you take that tack that we shouldn't put it in? You know, obviously, we're going to get more applications. Maybe putting the definition out there ASAP would be a good thing, because this is going to be a definition that's needed in the future. If we just tag it onto your application, well, then we're going to go through the same thing again at the next one. I'm finding this application complex enough. I'd like to get a ruling so as I don't have to deal with it on the next application. Yeah. Personally, and staff is willing to give us that, I don't think we're reviewing our comprehensive plan and all of our rules, so I think that now's the time to put in a definition.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry?
No, I'm just saying, you know, why are you so much against it? You appear to just want to put it as a condition of approval. I can see that would make it real simple. We just add it on the end and it's a condition of approval.
Yeah, I wasn't doing more than just suggesting that as an option, but my concern is that in a similar use, the Planning Commission has the ability to either just recommend to the Board of Commissioners. Either way, your decision here has to go in front of the board. They make the determination whether or not they want to add it in as a change to the ordinance. And we're concerned that if they do that, that adds probably several months in cost to the applicant and so on. We think this is a very benign use. And if they do want to add that in, I think that's a process for the RCC and the Rural Community Commercial Zone updates that will be going on in the current comp plan revision. Plus, I think that I haven't looked at it in more detail, but I believe the Miles Crossing Jeffrey Garden area no longer qualifies just as a rural community commercial zone. It probably should be an urban community, urban rural community, which is a higher standard, or they allow a more intensive development. For instance, if they have that definition, the DLCD no longer prohibits buildings to 4,000 square feet. They can go up to 8,000 square feet. And you can see that your larger buildings and more intensive applications are probably more in line with what the general commercial zone used to allow there, and the light industrial zone just around the corner allows. And that could be, the kind of flexibility that the commission and staff and the Board of Commissioners might want to see.
Holding right there, Mr. Kapling, I'd like to ask staff to please comment on what Mr. Kapling had just said about if this goes forward. With a request for staff to put a definition into the process, and that the time for the commissioners to approve it, would it be significantly delayed, as Mr. Kapling suggested, and extra cost to the applicant?
So if I can address that, please. So with regard to the definition isn't necessarily needed for the board to look at this and determine whether or not the use is similar. And the definition can move forward separately and independent of this application. So that particular part of it, I don't think would have any impact on this particular project. I think what Mr. Kaplinger is concerned about is that when this moves forward to the Board of Commissioners, you, as the Planning Commission, can make a recommendation to the board that it be included as by ordinance. So not just that we find that it's similar, but that we actually want to put this in the code so that applicant number 3, when they come in, doesn't have to go through a similar use process. It would just be a conditional use process and probably wouldn't have to come back to the board at that point. As I've read the ordinance, or as I read the ordinance, I should say, that if the Planning Commission and the Board of Commissioners want to add trucking, commercial as a conditional use, that I would not put the onus of the application fee back on the applicant at that point, that it would be something that the board has instructed staff to do, and that we would just bring it forward to the next Planning Commission meeting and then back to the board in an ordinance form. So yes, it would add time, but not necessarily money.
But not to this particular application, it would be separate.
Well,
Well, it would, yeah, if the Board of Commissioners says we want to add this by ordinance, and that actually is a good question, because, they have found it similar, but if they want to add it by ordinance, then I think at that point, we do have to say you need to wait another probably 6 weeks.
Okay. Personally, I think Mr. Kapling has brought up a very good point, and I think it bears consideration. So how could we take that out of this and move it ahead independently of any application, such that we've got it into the ordinance and just have it on its merits? Do we need to have that in there if we just put it as a conditional use?
Well, you, as the Planning Commission, cannot add it as a conditional use.
Well, we make a recommendation, I'm sorry.
Right.
Can we make a recommendation to the commission that it be number 13 of the conditional uses for having this in their restrictions?
You can make that recommendation, but then that will still have to come back in an ordinance form through the Planning Commission and back to the Board of Commissioners.
I'm not going the ordinance route, okay? What I'm just saying is that this is a like use, that I approve it, that I say commercial trucking can be used with this application. And I just want to move it forward as a conditional use, that commercial trucking is allowed in the RCC zone.
The only way to do that, though, is to amend the text of the zoning code, and you do that by ordinance. And so it would come to the Planning Commission and to the Board of Commissioners. So what I would suggest, if that is what you want to do as the commission, the Planning Commission, then you make one motion to find that this particular use is similar to public works, yard, and buildings, which is what Mr. Kaplinger is requesting. You make a second motion that says you do not want it to be included by ordinance for this particular, at this particular point in time, but then you would also want to make a recommendation to the Board of Commissioners that they direct staff to come back, and before future applications come in, that we make that, bring that ordinance forward, amending the code. Does that make sense? So I would look at it as three separate motions. One for the similar use for this, two being that you don't need to have this particular similar use adopted by ordinance, but that you do think we need an ordinance amendment, and that comes forward in the future.
The thing that I'm looking at is, I personally don't feel that we should encumber this applicant with the process of putting it into the ordinance and delay the application. So I'm looking to try and bring this forward as quickly as possible to the commissioners and have it finally approved, if it is approved. I'd like it to be on the normal process of application, because to encumber this applicant with the ordinance process, I think personally it's unfair. It's just come up at this time, and we're just finding out this information. So therefore, I think it's a project that we should be working on at a later date. So I guess what I'm going to have to ask for is that staff craft the individual recommendations here, and we approve them or not. We'll vote on them, because the motions are going to be fairly complex here. So I think I'm going to ask staff to put one by one and put them forward, and then we either approve or disapprove
So
those.
just to clarify, this is going with the three-motion approach that Gail just proposed, where the applicant wouldn't be held up by the process of adding the use to the ordinance.
Okay, that's my opinion, so I'd like to get the opinion of the rest of the commission.
I like that opinion too, but I was just going to ask, are we going to still have time to ask questions about?
Absolutely,
Okay.
yeah, this is just the preliminary here. Yeah. We're trying to establish the process.
Yep.
And now we're going to work within the process, hopefully. Robert, what do you feel?
This is beyond that, going back to just preceding. There was one phrase I got lost on, where you said it's an urban something rather than a rural something. I just needed to hear it again, because I wasn't familiar.
If you, under the DLCD, and I don't have the statute in front of me, but I could provide that to staff, who could also provide that, but it defines the, this is an OAR, and defines a rural community commercial,
Yeah.
or rural community rather, what that is, and then an urban rural community.
And that was the thing that kind of threw me, urban rural community.
Yeah, and it has statutory definition, and urban rural community, for instance, has to have at least 150 residential units, and I'm not sure that Miles Crossing, Jeffers Garden reaches that threshold. Then it has to have a mix of residential, industrial, commercial uses, and so on. So the distinction is not really great, but that 150 residential units stands out in my mind. That's one that would have to be. And then if it meets that, that's something that staff, the commission could decide to change that designation as part of the comprehensive plan or not. But it might make sense considering the direction that development interest is going in that area.
Thank you. The thing that boggled me was the urban and rural community, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's in there. I have the reference in my files, and I can provide that to staff, and they can give that to the commission.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions? I've got one on page 35 of the approach here. I see that we're dealing with the setbacks, and on reading the notice here, I see that we've got a setback of, let me see, 150 feet from the back and 130 feet from the front. That gives a total of 280 feet out of the property of 327.89 feet, with a 60-foot building, I see a discrepancy of 12.11 feet. So where do you want to make the building? Do you want to make it 12.11 feet less, or?
Well, if there's a discrepancy, we can submit a revised site plan, but the 12 feet would probably come out of the front yard setback,
Right.
and that would still meet the setback.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm just pointing out that your numbers, to me, don't appear to add up.
Yeah, I think that was the building shifted in position. I used to have it the other way, and Mr. Benish corrected that, and then I didn't correct the,
60.
pardon?
And 50 feet was closer than 60. Is that
Yeah. A little bit,
a little bit?
Yeah.
2.11 feet.
yeah.
Anyway, I'm just saying, maybe a revised site plan to find that 12.11 feet. Any other questions?
Well, talking about the site plan, the same basic diagram comes up about 5 different places
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
packet.
Right.
And in some cases, the parking's in one place, in some cases another, so I'm not too concerned about it, but it seems like there should have been one diagram that was consistent throughout, just to make it entirely clear. But I did have just a couple of questions, and they're not biggies. I just kind of want to know, what exactly is a silt fence? What's that like?
What is a silt fence? It's a geotech fabric, which is very dense, and it doesn't allow the fine particles of silt to move through the barrier, and it generally is I delineate the line that we propose to install the silt fence. That's one of the first things that the applicant would do, and it's buried in the earth, usually 6 or 8 inches or so, maybe up to a foot, and earth is put around it, and then it's supported by stakes. So it's a panel, a fabric panel that's generally about 3 or 4 feet high, and it runs that entire length, so that any water that comes down that area carrying fines with it will be stopped at the fence. The water can pass through, but the very small fines cannot. So that's why they call it a silt fence, because silt is a very, very fine particle of soil.
Yeah.
It looks like a weed suppressing.
The same sort of thing. It's a black fabric, very, very densely woven, you know.
If I could jump in as a point of clarification, the site plan we have there in the staff report and in the exhibits is a preliminary site plan and stormwater drainage erosion control plan. So the applicant has sort of gotten ahead of just a basic site plan, has included information about the grading of the site. And so they've shown a temporary soil stockpile there and the silt fencing, which we should maybe clarify if that's going to be there permanently or if that's a during construction erosion control measure.
That was my next question.
Okay.
Is it permanent, or is it?
No, it would just be temporary. Once the site is rocked in, the entire site will be pervious, and you shouldn't really be receiving any runoff at all from it, unless there's a flood.
That was another question I have. So based on the thickness of the rocking and the type of soil beneath that rock, you expect there to be no significant overland flow toward the wetland. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and then on that drainage ditch along the east boundary, is that a ditch that it seems to go on beyond the property? Is that something that some kind of district maintains, or is that something the property owner is responsible
Well, it's pretty overgrown right now. It doesn't look like anybody's been maintaining it. I don't think it's part of the diking district, and their facilities. It's kind of an on-site ditch. It does run off to the back of the property and probably connects to a larger ditch or drainage in the hierarchy. But I imagine that, that Mr. Benish or Mr. Horton may decide to keep that maintained a little better.
Yeah.
It's not part of the jurisdictional wetlands or anything like that, so.
Yeah, I felt like I could actually see it on the aerial photo, at least along the south line
Around what page are you?
on packet page 6. So I was just kind of curious about it, but it's not really an official ditch of some sort.
Well, it carries water, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not a county kind of thing that.
No, no, it's not maintained by the county or the Diking District.
Okay, that was my only question.
A lot of those drainage ditches, if you don't maintain them for a period of 5 years, you're kind of stuck with whatever they are. You know, you can't drain wetlands. And so is it okay to drain something that is no longer considered a wetland? You know, but just historically, if you have a ditch and you don't maintain it,
Yeah.
you're stuck with,
So you're saying it is what it is? kind of?
yeah.
Okay.
Well, look, if I can clarify, I'm not sure if you're saying it was intended to drain the wetlands, which used to be mapped over most of the property, but it transfers water from the road actually to the south, because the drainage doesn't go toward the highway. And there's a ditch along the roadside, and there's a culvert underneath the existing approach apron. And then this ditch intercepts that and takes water toward the south and drains off into probably one of the canals.
Okay, any other questions of the applicant? Hearing none, thank you.
Thank you very much.
So are there any comments from proponents? Are there any comments from opponents? Obviously, no opponents, then the applicant doesn't have a rebuttal. Does the public agencies wish to respond? There were none. Does staff wish to respond?
No further comments. Are there any questions for staff?
Yeah, any final questions? Okay, so into our discussion, what I would like to do, because of the complexity of this, I would like to take a 10-minute, 15 minutes recess here and allow staff to craft the motions for us, the three, so that they can be read into the order and we can have somebody pick it up and second it and we can approve or disapprove it. Gail, is that appropriate?
Yes, that would be fine, thank you.
Okay. Let's take a 10-minute, 15-minute recess here. Thank you.
Bring it into recess. Go play kickball?
Yeah.
Specific wording here, we need to get into this.
Yes. So when is Sally coming
So it's
back?
kind of like this page right here.
Next Saturday. I took this Saturday.
Okay, so next Saturday, the, whatever, next Saturday, the 14th. Yeah,
Something like that. Well, no, it's a Saturday. I better be at
you better be.
the, I'm missing her already.
Well, of course.
Okay. Are there any final questions of witnesses or staff? Do you have any? Okay. So discussion's open for planning commission members. All right, so in front of you, you've got the three proposals for putting forward a motion. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, move to closing the public testimony. So public testimony is closed. Are there any procedural motions pursuant to Ordinance 197.763? Hearing none, we'll go on to the motions and seconds. So staff has kindly put a recommendation out there. If anybody wants to pick on number one.
I move that the planning commission approve the consolidated application similar use request 20190512 and conditional use request 20190513 and adopt the findings and conditions of approval found in the staff report dated 27 November 2019.
I second the motion.
So it's been moved and seconded to move that the planning commission approve the consolidated application similar use request number 20190512 and conditional use request number 20190513 and adopt the findings and conditions of approval found in the staff report dated November 27, 2019. All those in favour?
Aye.
None opposed? That's unanimous. Anybody want to pick up number two?
I move that the Planning Commission recommend the Board of Commissioners to affirm the Planning Commission's approval of the consolidated application number 20190512 and 20190513 and not require an ordinance amendment for this application to proceed.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded that the Planning Commission recommend to the Board of Commissioners affirm the Planning Commission's approval of the consolidated application number 20190512 and 20190513 and not require an ordinance amendment for this application to proceed. Any discussion on that one? Hearing none, all those in favour?
Aye.
Aye.
None opposed, that's unanimous. Anybody want to pick up number
I
three?
move that the Planning Commission direct staff to prepare an ordinance amendment within 6 months to add commercial trucking as a conditional use in the rural community commercial zone.
I second the motion.
Seen moved and seconded to move that the Planning Commission direct staff to prepare an ordinance amendment within 6 months to add commercial trucking as a conditional use in the rural community commercial zone.
I move to amend that motion by changing commercial trucking to trucking, commercial.
Okay, discussion on that.
It needs a second to happen. Even be discussed.
Hearing no second, there's no amendment. So we'll go back to the original. Move the Planning Commission direct staff to prepare an ordinance amendment within 6 months to add commercial trucking as a conditional use in the rural community commercial zone. No further discussion. All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye.
None are opposed, so that passes unanimously. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Thank you.
Okay, so this will go to the, it should go to the first board meeting in January.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Congratulations.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Likewise.
Okay, so we're into the code consolidation and modernization.
Okay, so this is the second part of the conservation other land zones, and it includes 4 zoning districts, which include open space, parks and recreation, quarry and mining, rural community parks, and recreation management. And as part of preparing the table, what I did was, since so many of these uses have duplicate requirements with regard to either a resource capacity determination or an impact assessment or regulations regarding piling, dredging, and one other thing that I have forgotten, I just basically pulled those out and made them footnotes, which shortened the table from about 300 pages to about 50 pages. And that way, it's all consolidated in the same area, but you will have to flip through a few pages to get down to the footnotes to find out what the requirements are. We're anticipating we've got one more set of zoning districts to go through. That will come to you next month, and then we have the final combination of the last article, which would come in February, and then that would complete the round of draft review. And then from there, we would move forward with the actual cleaned-up consolidated document, probably in April or May, and bring it to the Planning Commission. So at this point, I'm here to answer any questions you might have about this particular chunk that we're looking at today.
Hold my hand on what is now, with the changes, not allowed to be done in open space, parks and recreation. You know, and there, I think somewhere it makes reference to you can do the same things that are in such and such an acronym. And I just haven't merged. My first sense was that it was restricting what you could do out in open space, park and recreation, when it seems that we're trying to trend toward protecting open space in the county. And that, you know, I'm happy to be, it's not a matter of my being mistaken or not, I just don't have a grasp yet of, in this shuffling, is there more constraint on what you can do in open spaces, or can't do.
So as part of the consolidation project, we're not proposing changes to uses. So if it's in here now, it remains in here. Now, there is obviously always an exception to every rule. So with regard to open space, parks and recreation, for example, as an outright permitted use that somebody would need to come in and get a development permit for, we list historical or archaeological site or area.
Can you grow mushrooms in an OPR as an agricultural?
Probably not psychedelic mushrooms, but yes, otherwise I think you'd be fine.
You're natural to the area.
So what we are recommending, though, with regard to uses is why would we require somebody to come in with a development permit? And this is more a question in my head, and say, I need a development permit because I have a historic building on my site. And I don't know if Julia has any thoughts on that, but to me, it wasn't common sense. So we did recommend taking that out.
Yeah.
You're historic, you're there, you're an archaeological site. We certainly don't want a public record development permit identifying where that archaeological site is. So, but no, otherwise the uses stay the same.
Could you explain exactly what the difference is between open space, parks and recreation and rural community parks?
I think Julia might better address that. The way I see them is we have found, or at least I'm finding, that open space parks and rec are on more of your larger regional parks. We see it a lot on state lands that are controlled by the State Department of Parks and Recreation. And I see the rural community parks as being in those areas like Miles Crossing, Jeffers Gardens, Westport, where they're smaller, very centralized, specific community parks. But Julia may have some institutional knowledge that talks about why we have two different classifications.
No, that's it.
Okay.
What is the county-owned place for the Boy Scouts camp? Is that F-80? You know.
Yeah, I think it is.
Kelly Wigglelug or whatever it is?
I think it is.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I don't know that.
It was one of the things where part of the idea of OPR being there was that it was provided continuity between Carnahan Park and the Scout Camp. But it was also an era when the county didn't want to make that a park because they also were kind of against having more parks. And, you know, anyway. So it's I'm glad we're sorting through this with fresh thoughts, but, you know, some of these, it is a matter of trying to pull up Bruce's institutional knowledge, Julia's institutional knowledge as to how we got where we are, and that things aren't necessarily there for reasons that currently could be deemed rational.
I just think it's a great way to get it consolidated, and you've
Yeah.
got cross-references, and people can
Yeah.
find things without having to look under C or D or whatever.
Yeah.
It's under
One
proper
name.
area. It just makes it so much easier.
Yeah.
So, as you said, we're not really modifying the uses allowable in areas, but at some point, we're going to look at that, correct?
Yes.
There are some ones here that don't make a lot of sense. For example, mining or mineral extraction, and for some reason, that's not shown as an allowable use in a quarry area. And yet, there's mining surface or subsurface, and that's treated differently. So there are some things in here that either need to be clarified to me why there is a difference, or else ultimately we'll be hopefully making some changes to those. Also, I saw an example around research and educational observation, and I didn't understand why that wouldn't be something that would be pretty much allowable in a lot of these areas.
That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a good one, Chris.
So I look forward to having a chance to get into the modifications of those after this whole initial consolidation process is undertaken, completed, whatever.
You got any other examples? I got some good ones.
Those were the main ones.
Main ones,
Yeah, those were some of the main ones I saw.
All right. So, do you have any questions? Any other questions of staff? Robert, you satisfied?
I know that it will take looking at it afresh. You know, I will throw in, I was simultaneously with trying to understand this, involved with euthanizing a nearly 14-year-old collie. And it's sometimes hard to follow acronyms at the same time. So I'm glad this is not the, you know, that a lot of this, the comprehensive plan advisory committees will be looking at also to try and understand all of these reasons. You know, and I think there are a lot of areas that are interesting, like aquaculture, you know, that have always been laden with politics. You know, and they're just, all of these natural area issues have had reasons that things got put in there that only people who've been around since the flood, like Julia, recall.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Period.
So, let's move to the project update report. I was glad to see that we've got a one-year extension approved, 11/14/19. I was glad to see that came in. And I hope to see some permits go out and that move forward. I'd like to see that moving.
On those one-year extensions, is that sort of an automatic thing, or did they have to go through a
They had
process?
to come in.
Yeah, they come directly to staff. It's administrative, so it does not come back to the planning commission.
Yeah.
And do they have to pay money to renew that?
I don't think we charged a fee for that, no.
No, not unless it's like a
A subdivision we do.
subdivision, yes. Other than that, no, just a development permit or a conditional use, no.
Oh, good. All right, any other business?
Did you want an update on the comprehensive plan?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Sorry, did I jump over that?
you did, but that's
I
okay.
apologize.
So tonight, the Northeast Committee will be holding their final meeting of the year. It's at 4 PM at the Napa Fire Station. Tomorrow, Southwest Coastal has their final meeting of the year, which will be at 10 o'clock?
Yes.
Yes, at the Arch Cape Fire Station. And that will conclude the round of meetings now until April. So all the committees will be taking off January, February, March. All of them will have completed an initial review up through Goal 4. And so when we pick up in April again, we'll be starting with Goal 5. In the meantime, staff will be working on drafting revisions to the policies in Goals 1 through 4 based on the input that we've received at the various committee meetings and public meetings and workshops. And I'm even getting postcards in the mail now. So that's where we're at for right now. So if you don't make a meeting by tomorrow evening, you'll have to wait until April.
Yeah.
But-
Any comments?
Happy holidays.
So, do you feel that you've got good responses on these meetings? I know we always are looking for more participation, but do you think that there are a number of good ideas came out? I personally thought forestry was really good. We had a lot of input, and a lot of opportunities to ask questions. I thought this was a good process.
It's been going good, and it's certainly growing as word gets out more on the street. And especially, I think, with Goal 4, the forestry lands, that really drew a lot of interest from many different areas of the community. And so I think as we move forward now, starting next year, we'll hopefully continue to sustain that involvement and that input.
Yeah.
I think the LCD made an appropriate comment early in the game that you can't force participation. You know, we can do a great job wishing for it, but there's going to be someone, people who will come up late in the game saying, hey, what's this about? I didn't know about this.
They had an opportunity to, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And I think that's the bottom line. When people come up and say, hey, what about this? We have provided a process of many opportunities for them to participate, so it's up to them to do it.
Okay.
I personally thought the meeting that we had here for Goal 4 was, I thought that was really good. What do you think of that? There was a diversity of participants, had a lot of different points of view. I enjoyed it.
I was sorry not to see all the people at all of the meetings. It was kind of hard to keep straight.
Right.
This is the Goal 4 conversation. This is the Goal 4 countywide advisory committee meeting. This is the something else. But they all contributed to the discussion.
Yeah.
But I was certainly lost when I was supposed to be the report as a liaison to the whole, or from the whole to the area subcommittee, where I'd been, because there was a whole lot of action going on, just like we're here talking about the same stuff. There's been damn good citizen involvement, however you want to slice it.
Yeah, but I thought that the questions and discussion at that particular meeting was varied and very good points of view were brought up. You know? I mean, I kind of came to the meeting thinking I knew a fair amount, but boy, I sure learned a lot at that meeting. You know? There was just a lot of good points of view brought forward, and I thought it was a great meeting.
There were people who showed up at different meetings,
Yeah,
like the Browning contingent, you know, bringing in their expertise, you know, there were.
right.
People earlier who say, I'm not going to go to that because it's just going to be a bunch of talking heads, and then showed up and knew by that time not to have a chip on his shoulder.
Well, I was glad that he did. I
Yeah.
was glad he did turn up because he made a lot of good points.
That's right.
So, yeah, no, it was good. It's compromise. It was good for everybody to listen to everybody's point of view.
Yep.
Okay, anything else?
Yes, just one more item. On Thursday, December 12th, this coming Thursday, at 12 p.m. at Camp Rylea, there is a public meeting with Solutions Oregon and the team that's been put together about the elk, the Clatsop Plains elk. So it is a public meeting, and everyone's invited. So,
And Warrior Hall is the one down the street from headquarters, as I recall. You know, it's hard to even Google. Now, where is Warrior Hall at Camp Rylea? It's not easily known. You know, it's easier to find the Officers Club or something. But I do anticipate going with a snarky thoughts about it being a namely bureaucratic process, but I think it's worth gutting out through 3 hours of an annually bureaucratic process to see what they say about the darling elk.
So there's a lot of them. Okay, anything else?
No.
All right, Julia, anything?
Not I, thank you.
Right. Well, I, for one, would like to thank staff for their participation in getting the correct terminology for the motions into the record. I thank you very much for doing that.
We will let Ian know.
Even though trucking, commercial is more consistent with
Yeah, well, we
where
can,
we've been headed.
we can fight that out later.
Oh, shoot.
All right, thank you very much. We're adjourned.
It's a work in progress.